Good good morning. Good Yes. Good morning, everyone. Please come in and take your seat. Welcome everyone to SCORAI Europe 2025. It's a real pleasure to have you all here. My name is Matthias. I'm the conference chair, and when I'm not chairing a conference, which is most of the time, I am a researcher at the International Institute for Industrial Environmental Economics, which is based here at Lund University, actually just across the park. You'll get to know it because part of the session program is there. This conference, SCORAI Europe 2025, is a joint effort by two major research projects focusing on sustainable consumption. On the one hand, the Sweden-based MISTRA Sustainable Consumption, and on the other, the EU-funded 1.5 degree lifestyles, as well as the SCORAI Europe network. You'll hear more about all of these three in relation to each of the keynotes. So every keynote will be briefly introduced by a representative of one of these three organizations or networks. If you want to know more specifically about the SCORAI network, I invite you to join the SCORAI network meeting tomorrow evening between 6 and 7 p.m. in this room or online. There you can learn more about the organization and what it does in general. Now, when we got together a little more than a year ago, among others mostly to agree that we would organize this conference, but also among others to agree on the title, Mainstreaming Sustainable Consumption, we thought ourselves in a world where there was a lot of disagreement and conflict, obviously, but still, by and large, an agreement that sustainable development is important, that sustainable consumption is needed, that the questions that we are facing are about how to mainstream the efforts that are already going on and thus make the necessary steps towards a sustainable future. We also thought us in a world where it was obvious that research and us as researchers have an important role to play in this and are considered an important actor in this effort to achieve sustainable consumption, sustainable development. And if you ask me, boy, has the world changed in the last 12 months or so. So now we have the administration of the most powerful country on earth trying to eradicate any notion of climate change from official documents. You see global attempts for global cooperation crumbling before our eyes, and not least, you see the integrity of research being questioned and the role of us researchers being questioned. So suddenly, there's a much deeper meaning to this conference also, I would say, and that is, what is our role as creators of knowledge? What is our role as advisors to policymakers? And what is our role as public opinion makers? And while I don't think that what I'm saying now will help to lift the mood in this room and at this conference necessarily, I do think it gives it urgency, because we are meeting here for the next 3 days not only as experts to exchange ideas and to exchange knowledge, but we meet as a community with a mission. And that's partly what this SCORAI conference is also about. And because of what I at least believe is this urgency and importance of meetings like this, I am really, really thrilled that SCORAI Europe 2025 is bringing together so many sharp-witted individuals. So in total, if you combine you here in Lund and the participants online. There are about 550 participants at SCORAI Europe 2025. And in 50 scientific sessions with roughly 300 presentations and 22 workshops over the next 3 days, you'll have plenty of opportunity to exchange both ideas and knowledge, your sorrows, if there are any, there might be plenty in the last couple of days and weeks, and your visions for the future. I also briefly want to mention that because we forced all of you to complete an online survey about your carbon footprint, you might be curious about the results. You will hear those, but only on Thursday, on the last day, at the ending of the conference. So you have to stay to know the truth. But also, for those of you who did submit an email address with your survey response to that carbon dioxide survey, you'll get a follow-up email in about an hour from now asking you whether your initial travel planning was correct. So you have an opportunity to update in order to give us as accurate data as possible. Right. So with that, the only thing that is left between you and the actual fun part of the conference is a little bit of admin stuff or background information so that you can make the most of the conference. So here's a satellite image of all you need to know from Lund in the next 3 days. There is what is called AF-borgen or AF Castle, which is where we are now. That's the main conference venue here. This is where all the food will be served, among others, and all the scientific sessions will take place. Oh, by the way, all the food is vegan, in case you're wondering, or not wondering. Yeah, and then apart from the AF Castle, which is here, there is the IIIE, which is where I'm based usually, and all of my colleagues. And this is where all the workshops are. And you see, it's literally 150 meters walk, and luckily we have pretty good weather, so it should be pretty pleasant to walk back and forth between the two buildings. For those of you who join the Mingle tomorrow evening, there's a third building that is relevant, and that is what here is called Kulturen. And there's two crosses there, a green one and a blue one. And if you compare this with, for those of you who have booked the Mingle, you either have a blue dot or a green dot, and that is because we have to sort you in two groups, which will eventually reunite for the dinner. But you're too many to deal with in one go. So you split up in two sections, and then half of the group has the pre-drink in one section of the open air museum, the other half in the other, and then eventually you are merging back together for dinner. So that's if you wonder that. If this satellite image doesn't help you enough, here's a picture simply taken from outside. So you see that the wall to the left there, that's the back of this building. Then the white building in front of you is the Open Air Museum Kulturen, and then behind the trees there, the brownish building to the right is the IIIE. I've already briefly mentioned what your name tag means, in particular at the bottom left. So if it says Mingle 84, then you have signed up for tonight's Mingle. If it says Mingle 94 and a dot, then you've signed up for tomorrow's Mingle. And you need those also to get in. So your entry ticket is your name tag. Briefly also, again, about the conference. It's not an app. I wish it was an app. We had a plan at one point, but that didn't work out. So instead, it's your browser that takes you to a mobile-friendly version of the conference platform. And you have all received, or you can at least receive a one-pager that gives you an overview of the program. We also have a few copies of the entire program that you can review if you prefer it in paper, but I can tell you it's not easy to navigate that document. So I recommend that you, on your phone, log into the ConfTool platform, and there you can see either your personal agenda if you've made one, or also the general program, and it's searchable and everything. And you can see on screens outside there and on an info sheet that you received how to easily get into the ConfTool platform from your phone. Right. Then, in case you haven't uploaded your presentation yet, there's still a chance to do that at what is called the upload station, which is just 4 computers in the back of that room over there, where you can connect the USB stick to a computer and drag your presentation into the right session. The last option is, of course, to, in the room, when you're actually there to present, transfer your presentation onto the computer from which you will present, but that takes a little bit of time. So we try to limit the amount of people that have to do it in the actual sessions. And then finally, because I'm sure that you will have plenty of questions throughout the 3 days that come here now at the conference, you can always look for anyone with a happy t-shirt like I'm wearing now. We come in either pink or blue, or when it's a little colder, in greenish or light green sweaters. And there's 14 of us which will be around to answer any questions. Good. That's all the admin. And so the last thing I have to say is that we're going to start today with a keynote, and there's going to be 1 keynote every day. I'm not going to say more about the keynotes, except that I'm very much looking forward to all 3 of them, and I recommend you very warmly to not miss any of them. And with that, I will hand over to my colleague from the MISTRA Sustainable Consumption project, Jürgen Larsson from Chalmers Technical University.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm the deputy manager of MISTRA Sustainable Consumption, and we're very proud to be one of the organizers for this conference. And of course, we're very thankful to Matthias for his competent and tireless work in organizing this. I won't thank you fully yet, though. We don't know how it will turn out, but it looks good. Looks good. Looks good. First, a few numbers on our program. We are 6 universities involving about 25 researchers, and we are including also 20 partners from business, public sectors, and civil society. We focus on 3 areas: food, the home, and holidays, as well as also analyzing total consumption. This is the last out of 8 years that we run this program, and total budget is about 8 million euros. And at this conference, we contribute with slightly more than 30 contributions. So we're very, very happy to finally present our results from this research. That's all I plan to say about our program. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Frank Trentmann. He is a professor of history at Birkbeck, University of London, and also at the Center for Consumer Society Research in Helsinki. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Frank Trentmann.
God dag, god morgon, tack så mycket to Matthias and everyone who helped organizing this wonderful conference. I will talk a little bit about water in a few minutes. Let's get going. If you sort of browse the web and you look for images of sustainability and sustainable consumption, one image that crops up again and again and again is the idea that you see in these pictures. We're holding the world in our hands, or to be more precise, each one of you, so you definitely, and I think those over there as well, the individual holds the destiny of the planet in his or her hands, and these images come from a variety of domains, some from business, but you also have a classic university image, and then I just thought I put in a rare moment of creativity from a German company, the Adidas sneaker. They turn it around. It's coming out of your shoe, the image. But the idea is very much directed towards the individual, and it's in a way trying to appeal to our conscience. We as individuals should do something about sustainability. So the question is where this comes from. And what I want to do really in the next 40 minutes is to explain and show to you why we need a long-term historical perspective, how we need to integrate our understanding of the dynamics of consumption in the past into our story of sustainability if we want to have a hope to tackle unsustainable consumption patterns. And so what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about the idea of sustainability and how that's entangled with the dynamics of what we think of as unsustainable consumption. And then I zoom in a little bit on three quite ordinary domains: water, energy in the household, and mobility patterns, to show the contradictions arising from ordinary consumption patterns. And then we think a little bit about the future at the end. Now, I think that, speaking as a historian, among non-historians, which unfortunately happens to be the majority of the world, I would say the most widespread narrative that informs their way of thinking about the present is the following. In the 19th and particularly 20th century, we see the expansion and explosion of mass consumption, abundance, affluence, which is destroying the planet. And then, in the late 20th century, politicians and people and scholars are waking up, and they're responding to that with the idea of sustainability and sustainable initiatives. So very much a sequential story. First bad, destroying the planet, then we come up with a response. This is fundamentally wrong, I can tell you as a historian. Instead, what we really need to, I think, recognize is that sustainability as such is not something very recent. It's not our great discovery, but effectively throughout the early modern and modern periods, so really from the 17th and 18th century, the expansion of consumption was always intertwined with concerns about scarcity, shortages, damage to the environment, local, regional, and increasingly also global. So the two should be seen as a dialectic that drive each other forward rather than as cause and effect. I've put up here the man who first introduced the word sustainable, nachhaltend in German, who is Karl von Carlowitz, who lived in the late 17th, early 18th century and was responsible for the forest management in Saxony. Saxony, so basically the area around Leipzig and Dresden, had a very large mining operation. For mining, you need wood and you need charcoal to burn and smelt the metal. And von Carlowitz realized, if you just do the obvious, and look at short-term profit, you will ultimately chop down the entire local forest and be with nothing left in 10, 20 years' time. So he wrote a very influential book, the Silvicultura Economica, basically economic forest management, in which he laid down the principles of forest management having to be sustainable with a view towards the future and the ability of future generations to enjoy the wealth of the region. Now, he did not have a planetary understanding. And also, he was not opposed to the iron industry. I mean, that's what he wanted to exploit. So there are many differences, but it's very important that his idea really starts to gain ground in the course of the 19th century. It is the paradigm which all European and Western forest and agricultural agronomists start to use. If we fast forward to Gro Brundtland, and her very influential report in 1987, that's when we think the term sustainability really takes off. And you all know her, the definition, her report announced by heart, I'm sure, that sustainable is now defined as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The basic question for a historian is, what's the influence of these ideas on each other, and can we see parallels but also differences? So to simplify it, is Karlowitz equal Brundtland or not? We'll see, it's a little bit more complicated. If you take a step back into the Renaissance period, so 15th, 16th century Europe, you see how very, very different society and people today approach consumption and what's legitimate and what's not legitimate. On the left, you see a painting from Florence of the bonfire of the vanities. What happened there in the Piazza San Marco in 1498 was that the Dominican preacher Girolamo Savonarola urged, pressed citizens of Florence to come out of the houses to pile up luxury goods in the square and set them on fire. So they piled up everything from musical instruments, paintings, oriental carpets, fine luxurious clothes, and set them on fire to demonstrate that they're not beholden by the temptation and power of material objects. The idea was you should lead a simple life and keep the temptations of consumption at bay. Now, there are many reasons for that, but one concern that all early modern societies had was that, in their view, resources and money were limited. So what later is called limits to growth was to them a reality. And the fear was that if people in Florence just start buying fashionable consumer goods, especially things that had to be brought in from outside the region, you would effectively reach the limits very fast, because money would flow out. The local shoemakers would stop making shoes because people wanted fashionable foreign shoes and so forth. And the stability of the society, and indeed what we now call the environment, would just collapse. So what most European societies introduced were so-called sumptuary laws. Those were laws targeting what communities considered excessive consumption. So you had hundreds of pages detailing what kind of gifts could you give at a wedding. Perhaps only 2 silver spoons, because if you gave 5 spoons, then you would start trying to emulate and give 10 spoons, and it would just escalate. So you have a fine-graded kind of dictionary of what to consume and what not to consume to keep consumption under control. It's entirely alien to us. I think Italy is the only country which still has luxury taxes on the books, and those are limited to yachts after a certain length. But other than that, the idea that a politician might win approval by going around and saying, I'm going to prohibit all sorts of consumption because they're bad for us, is unthinkable for us. But 500 years ago, that's the norm. So the first thing I think we need to do to understand the dynamics of consumption is how we sort of moved out of a mental world where consumption is evil, needs to be controlled for not just our spiritual well-being, but for the well-being of a community, to a world where choice, and hence the individual who has the planet in their own powers, gains ground. And the main story of that is what 18th century people were fascinated with and called the transition from wants to needs. So basically how objects and commodities that were desirable, perhaps even luxurious and rare and exceptional, morphed into being something that's so normal, taken for granted, that we just define them as something we need and take for granted. I've selected sort of 3 objects to sort of illustrate that transition. On the right, you see a man called Jonas Hanway, who introduced the umbrella in 18th century London. Yeah? So in 18th century London, no one had an umbrella. If it rained, you just put a hat on, or you just got wet. That's how it is. But Hanway had seen umbrellas being used in Asia, and so he had this umbrella made, and he would parade through the streets. Some people laughed at him and said, "What an idiot! You know, why waste money on this curious object? We've lived perfectly good lives as Englishmen without an umbrella." You then had, by the late 18th century, you started having sort of lower middle class people imitating Hanway and also having an umbrella. And in the 19th century, you started having working class people who sometimes had an umbrella. Huge outrage amongst middle class reformers. What are these people thinking? They don't have much money and they waste it on an umbrella? They should buy, you know, good piece of meat or bread or good English beer. But this umbrella is a complete waste of resources. It's luxury. Well, as you know, if you happen to visit London and you have a climate crisis, heavy 2-hour rain, you can just pick up an umbrella for £2.99 at any tube station now, and no one would think you're strange. That's, you know, umbrellas are normal. So there's a normalization going on very quickly in the case of the umbrella, from rare, curious object to something people just have. The second object right next to Hanway is a coffee cup. A Chinese coffee cup in a double sense, both that it is China in sense of porcelain, but it's also made in China and imported. No European manufacturer in the 18th century could produce anything to rival porcelain cups or teapots. They're glazed, they're hard, they're light. As you can see, they're decorated in a way no one can match. And what's important here is this is not just an individual object. It comes with a transformation of the social format of consumption, because tea becomes a social ritual. You have the tea party. If you want to have a tea party, you want to have a comfortable home. You don't want to invite people with drafty windows and a cold room. So what you see in parallel to tea drinking, hot beverages that comes with the import of exotic containers like this coffee cup, is you have a transformation of the home and a raising of notions of comfort, a term from French which is introduced into English exactly at this time, that sees the diffusion of carpets, wallpaper, curtains, and couches to sit on so you're comfortable. This object sort of reminds us that we make a fundamental mistake if we reduce commodities into a relationship just with the individual. We've got to do here with a transformation of sociability, and it's these social rituals which help to normalize objects of like porcelain and help them to become normal needs that we seemingly can't live without. The last item is Indian cotton. So these are hand-printed pieces of cotton imported from India, and you can see how richly decorated these are in the 18th century. And we have, we know a fair bit about cotton and its diffusion into European consumer culture. Those fabrics would be acquired and worn by poor working class women in mid-18th century London. So I will single this out because a widespread idea about consumer culture is, by non-historians, is that before the 20th century, only princes and royals or the nobility or very rich merchants were consumers. That's nonsense. These exotic goods reach deep into society, and we shouldn't think of them just as a trickle-down mode from the very rich to the very poor. Exotic cottons were in the first case picked up by the middle segment of society to distinguish themselves from silk-wearing elite groups. So we have the diffusion and normalization of an ever bigger volume of consumer goods in the early modern period. But that always comes with a debate about when a lot becomes too much and how you as a society should respond to possible shortages. And I've just listed here sort of a few milestones that propel the idea of scarcity and shortages and the need for sustainable management forward into the 20th century. In the 18th century, the Scottish Highlands generate, or the future of the Scottish Highlands generate a huge debate because you have outmigration. Scottish Highlands are not developed enough economically to support the population. So people are leaving, sometimes to the American colonies or Canada. So it's a debate, how could you develop this piece of land? And in a way that doesn't just lead to the erosion of the local, what we would now call ecosystem, by just chopping down all the trees. And you basically have two rival schools that suggest they have the answer for a sustainable future. One is market-oriented, sort of a liberal political economic vision, which says, the problem with the Highlands is there are too many barriers in the market, and that blocks really the successful, stable development of the Highlands. If you remove them, so if you remove the taxes, if you remove the obstacles, then the market will do it. The other school takes the exact opposite view and says, well, the problem is there's kind of underdevelopment that leads to excess and destruction in the Highlands, and what we need is state intervention. We need infrastructures that will channel the resources that are there and can manage them in a sustainable way. So it's an ongoing debate, which really is a precursor of today's debates on how should you tackle climate change. Should you rely on markets or should you rely on infrastructural investment and management? By the 1920s, these regional debates move more and more towards a global or planetary scale. So you have notions of the biosphere now already in the 1920s, and then after the Second World War, people start talking about the environment in the singular. Previously, environments were local environment, regional environment, and then there were other environments. Now you have a holistic concept. So this is now moving up the scale of the debate. By 1956, in the very middle of the post-war economic boom, you have conservationists in the United States, like Samuel Ordway, arguing that the United States in particular is reaching its limits. He thinks the boom is really drawing on so many resources that it can't possibly be maintained. His answer is we need to conserve resources. He doesn't talk explicitly about sustainability, but his whole thinking is very, very close to what we'll be discussing here in the next 3 days. And his answer is, well, you know, if you still want to have an economy in the next generation, the country and the people need to conserve resources, pull back from excessive usage. It's really a short step from that to the Club of Rome report. You all know the limits to growth in 1972, where sustainability means sufficiency. So effectively a form of conservation. This really changes in the 1980s and 1990s, first with Brundtland, but then also the UN conference on environment and development, which leads to the Agenda 21, where there's now attention to sustainability and consumption, but a growing emphasis on choice and on markets promoting more efficient technologies. So you have now consumption being recognized and consumption patterns being recognized, but they are not conceived in a social or cultural mode. They're principally about choice. And consumption is seen as an effect of managing the production side and the market in a better manner. I mentioned how tea production and comfort are social processes and are raising our sense of what we should be demanding in a normal way of life. There's a follow-on chapter to that in The Last Generation, which concerns our sense of thermal comfort, how we feel comfortable. But actually, some people may have really smart phones and can probably tell us what the room temperature is in this room. My hunch would be sort of 19, 20 degrees right now. What I've put up here is 2 graphs which show on the left the growing efficiency of buildings, domestic buildings in the UK. They show heat loss per dwelling and how the heat loss is going down, different parts of the house, the roof, the walls, the windows, between the 1970s and 2010. And it's a downward movement. But at the same time, you can see on the right how the indoor temperature in British homes, on average, is going up, even though the external temperature doesn't really change much in the same time period. So the experts who did probably 2 years of work to produce this graph behind this found that the average indoor room temperature in Britain went up from 14 degrees on average in 1970 to 18 to 19 degrees in 2010. So that's 4.5 degrees Celsius. Or put it in a different way, if we had a time machine and we moved back and entered a home in an English town in 2000, or in 1970, we would feel awfully cold. But to them, 14, 15 degrees, perfectly normal. So this is 20, 25 years. And of course, what it means is that not all, but quite a lot of the efficiency gains you had through better insulation, better windows, better technologies, were eaten up by a rising thermal comfort sense inside the home, but the people living there. Another way to imagine this is, to think of how people dressed in the past and now. If you watch old movies, so 1950s, 1960s movies, European movies, you'll notice how many men are wearing three-piece suits inside the house, in an office. Well, our conference organizers are walking around in t-shirts. This is quite new, so we can sort of see how even in short periods of time, we've seen on the consumption side major drivers of change, which respond partly to the house being better insulated, but are not just a function of that. Water and water use equally see a fundamental transformation in the periods during and after the economic boom that often sort of escape discussions of consumption which are concerned with commodities and advertising or consumer credit. And these three images sort of sum up where the real damage lies from a view of the planet. The first is a sort of typical garden in Australia. Gardening becomes really popular in Australia. Everyone wants to have a green lawn. That's a bit of a problem if you live in a region with heat waves and droughts. And the water use for these gardens is a multiple one of the water use inside the house. This is sort of important because when we think of sustainable initiatives trying to control resource consumption, water utilities have to tackle in a drought these ordinary assumptions about what is aesthetically pleasing, how you use the outdoor space. If someone has settled on a green lawn, it's very important to them. You can't just say, well, this is stupid in Australia, just get rid of it and have some desert plants. It's not very appealing. In Europe, you see a transformation of personal hygiene in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I've put up two pictures there from Europe. The gray one, the black and white, that's how Hamburg looks in autumn, even now. So this is from 1972. And it's an advertising campaign by the main utility provider who provides electricity, but is also entangled with the waterworks, to promote showering. And the background to this is that by that time, the vast majority, 90% of households had their own bathroom and shower. They also had their hot water boiler. But consumption patterns didn't automatically follow that technological innovation. So in 1972, only 20% of Germans took a daily shower or used on a daily basis hot water to clean themselves. So it was the exception. So the companies thought, this is really weird, we want to push this. Why is there so much resistance? And it turned out, their own research showed that people at the time in Germany thought that taking too many frequent showers was really bad for you because it would, as they called it, thin out the skin. And then you would have cracks in the skin and other problems. Actually, dermatologists warn of too many frequent showers even today. But this was seen as sort of an old sort of hearsay and resistance. So you had this promotional campaign, and as you can see from the poster, this wasn't just about be clean, it's be beautiful. Showering is actually something that just lifts your whole spirit. And so it's wonderful, herrlich. And by now, the majority of Germans do take a daily shower or twice daily shower. So this is a massive transformation. It's not just about water use, of course, but it's about the energy you need to heat the water. That's the real damaging effect. having a shower, having a bath becomes now a need, as you can see from the Austrians went one step further. I always say when I show this image, don't try this at home. So an Austrian company developed the pull-out bathtub. If you don't have space, it says, don't worry. You want to have a bath, you don't have space, we have the solution. It's in your wardrobe. We built in a pull-out bathtub, so you can also have a bath. So bathing becomes normalized. The energy used for thermal comfort that's lying behind this graph I showed is also changing massively in the last 70 years. So on the top left, you have a classic picture of an English home in the 1950s. The housewife has one open fire, which is the main heat source for thermal, but also is the main source for heating water. So she's just preparing to do the laundry. So she heats up water and then puts it in a bucket, and then the bucket serves for the laundry. And similarly, if the children and everyone else in the household had to be cleaned, you would have an even bigger bucket, and then you had a weekly bath. So that's the main way things are organized, and that means the heat source is in one place, and that place is where family life is organized around. You then move, in the other pictures you can see, you steadily move towards a more mobile form of heating. In the bottom left with Ringo Starr looking on from the wall, a German household from 1968. You can see the young, fashionable lady coming home, and it's nice and cozy, even in the corridor, because she has an additional heat source. Now that is still coal-based. It's called smokeless fuel, specially prepared coal, but it's now an individual unit with which you can use to top up the heat in different rooms. And then in the next decade, it's getting even cozier. You have night storage heaters in the color picture at the bottom that store the heat and then diffuse it throughout the home. This is hugely consequential because it changes what goes on where in the home. Those of you who have teenagers, this is where teenage culture starts, I would say, because you needed central heating ultimately to make children's rooms that had previously just been used for sleeping, to open them up into a playroom, a room to have parties, to hang out, and so forth. Previously, bedrooms were for sleeping only because they had no heat source. They were freezing cold. So social and consumption activities can now disperse into separate rooms. They themselves also open up for more consumption goods, because if you have a children's room that's heated, where the child can do homework or have parties, you can also put the second TV there, or radio, record players, and so forth. The dog in the color picture is there for a reason. Pets consume too. The Australian colleague, Yolanda Strenger, looked at energy consumption patterns during heat waves in Australia, and how households respond to price signaling by the utility companies trying to make them switch their air conditioning off to save on added tariffs. And she found a good deal of resistance, and the answer in the end turned out to be people had their pets at home. If you go to work in a heat wave, do you want your little doggy to suffer while you're away? No, of course. You want to have the AC set to 68 degrees and keep it running. So dogs, in fact, are, they're lovely. Don't misunderstand me, but they're as much part of our unsustainable consumption pattern as we are. the home is, of course, also the place where cooking and eating takes place. And it's a good illustration on how very well-intentioned initiatives trying to introduce more sustainable forms of consumption just hit and get repelled by these established habits of ordinary consumption, because things have become so normalized that it's very, very difficult to make them abnormal again. And perhaps a very revealing example is cooking in India, in the countryside, where you have something called the chula. It's a traditional stove. You can see that in the top left, which is used in the majority of households, and it's fired by a mixture of just wooden sticks or dung, dried dung, and things like that. And the problem is that many of the homes don't have proper ventilation, so you have a huge, millions of people dying from the consequences of inhaling the smoke years on, years off. Or people, it's mainly women who are dying. So you've had, in the last 30 years, one NGO after another hitting on this thing. This is terrible, we must do something. And coming up with initiatives to introduce what you see in the top right. It's the so-called improved cook stove, which is much more efficient, much less polluting. You can stack things up, you can heat things simultaneously, etc. Beautiful, not that expensive either. They go into the countryside, people say, thank you very much, this looks interesting, and then it moves into the after being tried once, it moves into the corner and is never used again. And the NGOs are sort of struggling to understand this, but there are many factors, but one main factor to which it boils down to is the traditional chula stove makes much crispier, better bread. So if you live in a region in India where bread, naan bread and other breads are the main food or main supplement to food, you do not want to move to a more efficient fuel source if it doesn't have the same nice, crunchy, slightly browned bread to offer. And so we have here sustainable technologies that run into nowhere because they effectively do not take seriously what everyday consumption patterns that have been so anchored are like. Now, my last practical example is about mobility. You see in the top left, Gunnar Nordahl. You're too young to know who Gunnar Nordahl is. He was known as Il Bisonte, the bison. He had moved from Sweden to Milan and was AC Milan's star player in the 1950s, one of the first Swedes to go and make a career as a football player. And he's playing, sort of heading the ball with a little Italian boy in the streets of Milan, right next to a big apartment block. And if you look carefully, you see, you wonder, this is Milan? Where are the cars? There are no cars there. There's no car in the street. He can play football with his little friend. There are no cars parked. Top right, you have an image from Essen in Germany in the 1950s of the main crossroad in the center of Essen. And you can see a sort of 3, 4, 5 cars are being parked with lots of gaps in between and hardly any car on the road. That's 1950s. Fast forward, bottom left, that's Essen today, also known as the traffic jam capital of Germany. You have about 480 cars per 1,000 people in Essen. So we've moved between the 1950s and now we've moved into completely different spatial and mobile world, which is very, very dramatic. You all know of course, about the tremendous volume of cars that have shot up. So Britain, 1950s, had 2.5 million cars. By the 1970s, you have 25 million cars. It's a tenfold increase. If you looked at passenger flights, or the number of passengers taking a flight, you have a tenfold increase. So something's going on here, and I think the main thing to think about is not just the objects, but the use of the objects. So of course, you know, producing a car is not very sustainable, but ultimately the damage of cars or planes is in the driving or in the flying. So what is this all about? Clearly, in the 1950s, people were alive and thought they were doing quite well, but they were not as mobile as now. When I say not as mobile, let's be precise. So to give you a sense, in Germany, if we compare 2002 and 2017, in 2017, people on average drove 20% more than in 2002. So in 15 years, the number of kilometers traveled went up by 20%. And with it, the number of minutes people spent in being mobile. And the majority, if we look at mobility studies and we break it down, what is all this about? The interesting thing is that in terms of the share of mobility, it's not work and education that goes up. It's free time, leisure, doing errands, and shopping. That's the bulk, actually, of travel. The title of this slide is, of course, the famous Kraftwerk song, and it means we're driving on the motorway, 1972. In 1972, so Munich Olympics, every third trip people took was taken walking, every third. Now it's not even every fifth. Yeah, so we see both an expansion of mobility, but we also see a shift of mobility patterns from walking for these shorter distances to ever more driving. At the bottom, the diagram is giving you, this is German data, which looks at the total kilometers of road traffic by type of vehicle. And as you will gather, the main one, the yellow, is individual car use, and then the top one, the green and so forth, that's just then bus and lorry. So you can see, even in this period from just in the last 20 years, we see an expansion of the kilometers in mobility taken up by individual car traffic. And if you then go one step further and say, well, who's actually inside the car? More and more car driving is one person only in the car, which adds to the car traffic on the road. Now, the latest data we have for Germany suggests that in 2023, actually the number of cars on German roads went down by 5% compared to pre-pandemic levels. And we don't quite know, is this sort of a one-off or is this a trend? But in case you think everything's always going worse, and coming from England, one is sort of tempted always to think everything's going worse and worse and worse. It's useful to point out that the English traffic patterns are the opposite of the German traffic patterns. In England, between 2000 and 2017, mobility actually declined by 10%. And the number of car licenses declined, and the number of people driving declined, and public transport actually increased. And I'm stressing this point because I think it alerts us to the actual flexibility that exists within mobility patterns, and that we can imagine, or not just can imagine, that we can point to countries that have seen quite unanticipated and unexpected downward trends, as well as assuming, as most future planners do, things will always just continue the way they are. Yeah? So things can go down as well as up. So where does this all lead us? I hope I've shown that it's not just, what sustainability means that changes, but consumption is not just a thing. It's a process which has a dynamic. The main dynamic has been from wants to needs, but at the same time, as certain things become normalized, other things drop out. So, taking short walks by foot, perfectly normal, becomes increasingly abnormal. So we have things going in two directions, but change is the ultimate, I think, point to take away. And to end up, I thought might be useful to think how people in the past imagined their future. We forget that. We always think, oh, we're the first ones to think about the future. But of course, our present was not so long ago a possible imagined future. So if we go back and look at future images of what everyday life and consumption looks like, we find things like this. This is a poster from 1920 Japan, from a series. This one is called "The Better Life Starts in the Kitchen." And in that image, in the top right, you see a sort of semi or quarter circle, which is the present or the past. A smoke-filled kitchen, unhealthy, unclean, certainly not sustainable, lots of coal there and charcoal being burned. And then the main image is, should be your future. This is the better life you should lead. You no longer cooking and doing housework on the floor. People are upright. You have a kind of forerunner of the modern kitchen with adjacent cabinets. You have gas and you have electricity. And you have a clean, healthy environment. This image comes from a whole campaign that was running in Japan in the interwar years. You have something similar in Europe around the life reform or Lebensreform movement. And what's so interesting about this image is that it literally told people, look, you can live a completely different life. And here's an attractive version. This image was promoted by a network, we would now say, of city planners, of the Ministry of the Interior, of architects, of health reformers, and absolutely crucial, consumers themselves. So housewives associations were hooked into this, and the goal was really to change everyday life and consumption patterns by changing the home, the material environment of the home. And so what this image really does, I think, it sort of sums up what perhaps the main lesson of history is for sustainable consumption, which is, if we could live differently yesterday, we can also live differently again tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And now we have some time for questions. So, and we have two persons running around with microphones. There is a quick hand Jessica is coming with you, the microphone there.
Thank you very much. Anne Cantel from the Fraunhofer Institute for Systems Innovation Research. I very much enjoyed this presentation and kind of this narrative from kind of wants to needs. However, I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit more about of history's lessons learned, about points of tension, because the history of sustainability is not just one from like wants to needs. If you look, for example, at the Scottish Highlands case, it's also one of, in that case, imperialism, colonialism, kind of coloniality as kind of one going through highly problematic in the conversationist kind of sustainable consumption history, for example, with natural parks, local communities. And another tension, you kind of alluded to that several times, is, for example, gender inequality, gender equality, kind of improving through kind of increased consumption, maybe heat consumption or kind of more space at home. But there are certain tensions too, right, that kind of I was hoping you would talk to a little bit more.
Yes, no, thank you. Thank you very much for giving the opportunity to say a bit more about that. So I put this image back because particularly the cotton, I mean, China is its own empire, and Europeans deal with it. But many of the exotic luxuries that become needs, the cotton, but also think sugar, coffee, tea, cocoa, tobacco, those are all tied in the sort of 16th to 19th century with an imperial colonial system that heavily relies on slave labor. So slaves initially, well, not just initially, slaves are commodities, legally speaking, themselves. So this is not, the wants and needs is the normalization of luxuries in, we would now say, the global north. So Europe is made possible through the colonial extraction of resources and through the slave trade. So this is not, this is not entirely a happy story. The question is, I come back to the gender point in a minute. The question is what I think the implications of this are for us in the present. We don't have colonialism. We don't have, slavery still exists. I'm conscious of that, but it's outlawed. And so we live in an international economy which has, depending on the day we're looking at the news, has more or less trade barriers, but we don't any longer live in a colonial system. My hunch would be that actually for our present, the tension points that are probably more relevant is what we can learn from international conflict and war. It's absolutely remarkable how in the First World War and in the Second World War, states managed to work with consumers to conserve resources for military purposes, obviously, but they managed to conserve resources in unprecedented ways. So the prehistory of recycling, for instance, of glass, of foodstuffs, etc., you can trace back to the two war times, and which suggests to me that states could be much more active than they at the moment are willing to add force, whether through taxation or regulation or direct intervention or mobilization. And I think I would say that's for me, that's sort of the main historical lesson, is that we have to remember people in the past were actually thinking of sacrifices as something positive. Now, I'm not suggesting we should go to war to do that, but what I am suggesting is that it's, I think, too simple to assume people are not prepared to make sacrifices, and hence we can't confront them with anything. On the gender point, no, absolutely. I mean, there are many inequalities which run through the story. I mean, the transformation of the home goes with new gender roles. But also with mobility patterns, I mean, we have tremendous inequality. I didn't have time to really unravel all the subtleties there, but mobility patterns are very unevenly divided in a society. And this is not just about flights. Also, if you look at car travel, I mean, one interesting thing is because people always think, oh, you know, we who live in metropolitan areas, we don't need a car, we don't need to be so much mobile. I mean, the German data suggests that it's actually metropolitan people who've become more mobile, as well as rural people. It's the people in small towns, interestingly, who've become less mobile. I mean, they're still mobile, but it's in a way. So in a way, if you looked at this data, my hunch, thinking about sustainable possibilities for the future, would always to say, look, as politicians and as planners, we should stop just looking always at the extremes where things are going up. We should actually look at this data and say, hey, if these people in small towns can reduce their mobility and save resources, what's going on there? Perhaps we can all be a little bit more like the small town people, or similar to the people who do less flying and so forth. I think that's the mistake.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. New question? Someone? Here? Yes, welcome.
Sylvie Lorik, Sustainable Europe Research Institute. Just a slight irritation here in this corner that there is no colonialism anymore.
In the front here, in the second row, Jessica.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. Kim Nicholas from Lund University. My question is what your research can say about how change becomes popular or what gives change momentum. Something I noticed is that you showed us a lot of pictures of advertising, which were selling consumption of more things, but our challenge now is to scale down consumption. So do you think advertising will play an important role in that? And what can we learn from this trend of going from wants to needs in the sense of popularizing luxuries, whereas now we want to depopularize luxuries and reduce consumption?
I start with your last point. I'm not sure that depopularizing luxury would be my instant advice. I mean, one can, for instance, imagine that certain forms of luxury, because they are more sustainable than other forms, might be things to push. So it might well be a good idea to promote particular luxury items, which, let's say, are more time-intensive forms of consumption, which, by being time-intensive, would actually conserve resources. That's on the luxury side. So I don't think the problem is luxury. The problem is forms of luxury consumption that are very damaging, and we have different kinds of luxury consumption. So just to give an example, if people were so tempted to buy a luxury handbag that costs 10,000 euros, I rather have them buy that luxury handbag than spend their 10,000 euros going every week to McDonald's or something like that. Yeah. So I don't think luxury consumption as such, I don't think is the primary example. I would also be careful of putting too much emphasis on advertising. I did not talk about advertisers specifically because I also don't believe that advertisers are the principal source or driver behind consumption patterns. One reason why advertisers spend so much money is precisely because it's difficult to influence consumption. It's not that straightforward. And what advertisers are doing really is they are, you might say, they're reinforcing or they're exploiting particular patterns, or they can amplify them. But I don't think to understand how we became a hyper-consuming society, that advertisers deserve as much emphasis as they tend to, or praise or critique, as they tend to get in a lot of discussion. That doesn't mean communication doesn't matter, and so this well, first of all, these the bottom images here are staged photographs by energy and utility companies trying to showcase what normal, comfortable life should look like. But this image is a series of posters produced by this public campaign. So it's not advertising in a commercial sense, it's a public campaign that was traveling around Japan to say, look, you could live like this. And I think this campaign worked because in the interwar years, homes were redesigned in Japan, and you can see it. I mean, you can see the fusion of modern or modernist elements in Japanese housing with Japanese styles of housing at the present. That goes back to the interwar years. But this worked because it had housewives associations, neighborhood clubs as stakeholders in the campaign. I think that's absolutely crucial. So in terms of communication, it depends on how can you bring citizen consumers on board and explain to them that this actually makes sense to them and have them as spokespeople. If this campaign had just been a top-down campaign by architects, engineers, I don't think it would have worked.
Thank you, thank you. So there we have a question.
I also stretch a little bit. Thank you so much. I was thinking that I remember also historian Ian Morris saying that development has come from like very greedy, very lazy, very comfortable people that want to make things more like easy to get and more comfortable even. And I was thinking a lot about this graph that you showed with the temperatures inside the home. And then when you were showing this campaign about beauty, like this shower makes you more beautiful, I was thinking also like, well, maybe more vain people also prompt this kind of behaviors. But I was thinking if you have some examples where, I mean, as this comfort that we're getting used to is increasing, and as you say also, this has been going very gradually, it can also go back. So I wonder if you have any examples of that, because I think that, for example, in the Global South, I am from Mexico, and in the homes, we also have these indoor clothes because we don't have this kind of heating in the winter. But I mean, of course, we have another weather. The houses are made to be fresh in the summer, in the heat, and then we sort of maybe take in the shorter winter, and we don't care much about having all these layers indoors, right? So, but I was wondering if you have any other examples of things that maybe go gradually towards being more uncomfortable or more active or more ugly even.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks.
These energy transitions I was showing, they don't go smoothly. They're also sources of conflict and tension, because once you introduce in blocks of flats central heating, or in some countries you then set standardized temperatures, which residents can't regulate themselves, it clashes with the wide spectrum of individual senses of what feels comfortable or not. So in the British case, you have countless tenants who are really annoyed about the introduction of central heating and who are putting pieces of clothing into the pipes to block out the heat reaching their bedroom because they like their bedroom to be a bit colder. So you have countless counter trends. it's not, I mean, the thermal comfort is very interesting because, of course, it's forced on us. So I can't come into this building and say, it's too hot for me, can we please turn it down? Because I'm only one person among many. So that's a problem. Norms, and who sets the norms? The reason why thermal indoor comfort went up has to do, in the British case, with things like the Parker-Morris report, who in the 1960s set norms, standardized norms for new buildings to be built in the new towns. So urban planners had to follow these norms and supply heat sources and insulation that suited that. Germany, by contrast, doesn't originally have these norms. There's the courts. It's local courts. So people, individuals going to the courts and saying, I'm renting this flat, and in winter, my flat is cold, and I'm still paying rent. This is not right. And so local courts, in the German case, in 1990, 2000, actually come up with rulings that say a tenant has the right to 20 degrees in their flat, and even at night, it should be 18 degrees, which is sort of, it's not quite clear where these rulings come from, but you have different social pressures, so the resistance of individuals is much harder, but you have plenty of counter trends. In Britain, I don't know how it is in Sweden, but in Britain, one big trend is cold water swimming. People deliberately want to swim in water that's 10 degrees or 5 degrees. They don't want a heated pool. Mass movement might be an exaggeration, but you have these counter trends, and so my view is always that people who actually think about urban planning, infrastructure investment, mobility patterns, leisure patterns, they should look at trends which lower the pressure on resources. What's behind that? Where does this come from? Can we reinforce it, or can we have similar trends? And you could roll that out big time, but that doesn't tend to be the norm. I mean, the people I've had dealings with in government and so forth, they tend to work with the average. They have an image of the average consumer, which really obscures the spectrum, or they work with the top. We need to provide buildings that meet the demand of the top demanding group. That's our only form of investment. And that's where things get narrow-minded.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, we must end this. So a big hand of applause to my... So you mentioned to look in the details, to look at the groups that are doing it more sustainable. That's what we'll do now for 3 days, and it's starting now in 7 minutes in various rooms. So please quickly move there, so we'll get started in 7 minutes from now.